Hey everyone, Enoch here. In this video, I want to take you through the complete process behind this mountain environment scene, from the earliest terrain generation stakes all the way to the final cinematic render. This project wasn't really about creating something overly complicated. It was more about combining small techniques, subtle details, and small artistic decisions to build an environment that feels believable, atmospheric, and cinematic. We will go through the entire workflow together, from generating realistic mountains using geometry nodes, to shading and texturing the terrain, building the composition, and even faking certain effects to save performance while still perceiving the cinematic quality of the final image. A lot of the realism in this scene actually came from very small adjustments, tiny details that completely changed the mood and scale of the environment. So, make sure to stay until the end, because some of these techniques might completely change the way you approach environment creation inside Blender. Alright, let's begin. First, let's talk about the mountain generation process. To create the terrain, I used geometry nodes, and honestly, this became the foundation for the entire project. I started with a simple grid and used a set position node to displace the geometry. To generate the height variation, I added a noise texture. At first, the displacement is not behaving correctly because the geometry is not being pushed properly along the surface normal. So, to fix that, I added a normal node followed by a vector math multiply node and connected the noise texture into the second input. And once you begin layering multiple textures and scale together, the terrain starts to feel surprisingly natural and realistic. That is really where geometry nodes became incredibly powerful. If you would like a deeper breakdown of this workflow, let me know in the comment. Who knows? I might turn it into a dedicated tutorial later on. Now, let's move into the shading process. But before texturing, I ran into one of the most common geometry nodes problems: UVs. Those terrains generated in geometry nodes have no UVs. So here is a very useful trick. If you want to transfer informations like UV maps or masks from geometry nodes into your shaders, go back into the geometry node setup and locate the data you want to export. In my case, it was UV map from the original grid. Then simply add a store named attribute node, choose the correct data type, and connect the information into the value input, and give the attribute a name. I called mine UV map. After that, inside the shader editor, add an attribute node and paste in the exact same name. And just like that, you can access geometry nodes data directly inside your material setup. Once the UVs were working properly, I started blending the snow and rock materials together. For this environment, I mainly worked with one snow texture and two different rock textures. And this leads into another extremely important technique. To create believable snow accumulation, use the geometry node and separate normal outputs into X, Y, and Z values. Then use the Z-axis to control where the snow appears. This allows the snow to naturally settle on upward facing surface while keeping the steeper areas exposed as a row. And if you want even more control, you can combine additional normal nodes with different rotations to shape the fall off and create softer, more natural transitions. That one small detail alone adds a massive amount of realism to the terrain. And if you would like a complete material breakdown, you can check the link in the description or the end screen. After the texturing process was finished, I moved on to the composition of the scene. Before I even started this project, I already knew I wanted one large mountain dominating the center of the frame. To make the composition easier, I used Blender's composition guides. Quick tip: always enable composition guides while framing your shots. Just select the camera, go to camera properties, and under viewport display, enable the guides you want. For this scene, I mainly used the search and center guides. Once the primary composition was working, I started adding secondary mountain around the environment. Most of them were simply a duplicated versions of the original terrain with different random seed value, but eventually the scene became extremely heavy. The geometry count was getting out of control and the performance started dropping fast. So instead of adding more real geometry, I decided to fake a distant details. And honestly, this technique probably saved the entire project. For the background mountains, I used simple 2D images instead of actual meshes. I rendered the stretched image of the terrain, placed them far in the background and darkened them slightly to create atmospheric depths. And because they were only images, they had almost no performance cost. I also faked the mist instead of relying on expensive volumetrics. Here's how I created it. I added a simple plane, created a new material and used a gradient texture. Then I pressed Ctrl plus T to generate texture coordinates. I rotated the mapping node 90 degrees on z-axis and connected the gradient into the alpha input of the principled base div. Finally, I added a multiply node to control the softness and visibility of the mist, and for the sky I used almost the exact same setup, just with an image texture instead. For lighting, I kept everything fairly simple and used Blender's built-in sky texture with a few subtle adjustments. And with that, the environment was finally completed. I really hope you found something useful in this breakdown, because at the end of the day, cinematic environments aren't created purely through complexity. They come from smart artistic choices, subtle tricks, and understanding where details actually matters. Thank you so much for watching, and if you want to learn more about my environment creation and texturing workflow, make sure to check this video. I'll see you there.